Okay, so number 2 lecture, Revolutionary War Causes. Also information you should have on your reading guide. So we've already talked about how the economy is based on mercantilism in the colonies and basically to control competition. Your mother country does not want competition from a colony. They began to pass ways to help stop smuggling and enforce mercantilism. So one of these was something called the Writs of Assistance. This is in Massachusetts. You're going to see a lot of this stuff that happens largely occurs in Massachusetts. Part of the reason why some of the revolution occurs there originally. Said that we can allow search and seizure of illegally imported goods without any evidence needed to say that I want to search and seize your goods. This is one of the reasons we have the Fourth Amendment to our Constitution added no illegal search and seizure. We're also going to have some division within the colonies. The South was seen as kind of a pet of the colony, of England. They grew non-English products like tobacco, the indigo, the rice, things we talked about. You can also see in the lecture some of the things that affected the South as well negatively. The British were in debt from the war we just fought, and half of this debt came from the colonies. So the British said, hey, how about you guys just paying a third, not all, not half, a third of the cost to maintain troops in America that are there to protect you? And we did not want to. So these series of acts began to follow to help pay for things. The Sugar Act, which you should have its purpose under number 6 on your reading guide. You should also have information about the Admiralty Courts and why they were significant and hated in the colonies. The Quartering Act said that the British were to be housed by the colonists. It doesn't mean necessarily we take your house. Many stayed in barns or on the land somewhere. They didn't really force colonists to allow soldiers, but it was still upsetting to a lot of people that we had to do that. This was the most hated act, the Stamp Act. It was a direct tax. It was a tax on a good, and at this point it was on paper to raise revenue for the military. And no money was ever made off of this. There were so many protests, and you had Stamp Act Congress created to fight against this. Tax collectors were attacked, tarred and feathered. And the tax collectors were actually threatened to the point that they even refused to issue the taxes. And they began to boycott British goods as well as a way to protest. So as you can read, these all the things that were taxed here. This is an example of the stamp you have to get. Colonists said, yeah, Parliament can legislate, but they can't impose taxes because we have no representation in Parliament. Parliament said you have virtual representation. If you are English, you are represented by Parliament. So you get that slogan, no taxation without representation. The colonists wouldn't have wanted representation anyway because they would have still been outnumbered in Parliament. But it's a great slogan. What they want is to just keep their money and keep the ability to be able to tax. So this Congress was created, follow up to the Albany Congress. This time non-colonies show up to talk about getting rid of the Stamp Act. Very effective, shows unity. Boycotts, they will find out, work very well against the British. They said, we're not going to accept the tax from Parliament. We would accept it from our local legislature because we elected those people. This is in Wilmington, North Carolina. The stamp master was forced to resign because there were threats made against his life and things of that nature. So it was throughout the colonies. A group organized to fight against the British, plot against them in several ways. Sam Adams was one of the guys who helped to do this, called the Sons of Liberty. You also had the Daughters of Liberty, urge boycotts, use colonial goods, sometimes violence, but not always. They typically tried to stay away from violence because it would deteriorate their support. Sam Adams was pretty much bad at everything except causing trouble, failed brewer, failed everything. But he would do things like tell people to go up to the British and accidentally poke themselves with their bayonets and scream police brutality, you know, that kind of thing, just to get people upset. So he was great at causing trouble. All right, so you can read this. Basically, it's talking about how the British are freaking out and wondering why these colonists, who were so few, won't pay so little for their protection. Eventually, Parliament tries to save face by passing the Declaratory Acts. It says, yes, we have a right to pass laws for the colonies. Again, pretty much ignored. But they saw they could hurt Britain with the boycotts. Throughout all this, King George is still the good guy. The bad guy is Parliament because they made the laws. They're still making toast to King George while decrying Parliament. But nobody's talking about independence yet. You can read this document on your own. No one, as I said, blames Parliament. Blames the King. They blame Parliament. There's a video on the Dropbox you can watch. It's called a King George III parody. There, it would start like this. Another set of acts were passed to raise revenue called the Townshend Acts. It was a tax on certain types of goods. It also allowed for illegal search and seizure of smuggled goods in your homes as well. Eventually, more boycotts followed, which led to the repeal of all of these acts except the tax on tea. We begin to also pass the Massachusetts Circular Letter. John Dickinson writes letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, which you should have information on. It talks about the right to regulate commerce, but not taxation. This letter, it was nothing new. Sam Adams was part of this, said Parliament get rid of the acts. But it was just one of those things, oh my God, we're tired of hearing this, and Parliament overreacts. Very few people read these. They were passed around, circulated throughout the colonies, mainly in the North. But it led to the British saying, okay, we're getting rid of all these legislatures. More troops are being brought in. That only unifies the colonies. Then we had this event called the Boston Massacre. There's also a video on the Dropbox about this that you can watch called the Boston Massacre. And you can get the information there and read through this and watch the video. So this is probably one of the more famous propaganda prints made by Paul Revere, and it shows the helpless colonists fighting against the strong-armed British. And the colonists have no weapons except this dog that seems to be barking at them. Just read through this, another example of the animosity being built between the two groups, the colonists and the British. We began to organize committees to spread propaganda or political education, whatever you want to say, about the British. All the colonies had these going on, by horseback, etc. You'll see some of this if you watch a video on YouTube called America, the Story of Us, Episode 1. It goes through a lot of this information as a good review.
Tea Earl Grey hot.
All right, so there is a monopoly on tea. And even with the tax that was on the tea, it was still pretty cheap in the colonies. The people who really suffered were the smugglers. The smugglers couldn't make as much money anymore because the tea was so cheap. So people like John Hancock, who was one of the biggest smugglers in Massachusetts, helped to organize this tea party to boycott the tax and to just try and make some money by getting rid of this cheap tea. So you can also see a video on the Dropbox called Tea Party, and there's a Schoolhouse Rock called No More Kings, which you can look at that as well. They dressed like Indians who disguised themselves, which again is a joke. Everybody knew who they were. There wasn't much of this disguise going on, but it freaked people out. George Washington said, uh-oh, we did something bad. Franklin said, we got to pay these guys now. And the British respond hard-handedly. Okay, you can see all this stuff, these things I talked about. They passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. And it had several parts that you were supposed to look up. They established martial law, and Massachusetts is being shut down, basically. So they feel like they're getting the brunt of all the hatred of the king and Parliament. But again, the king is still okay. It's more Parliament at this point. So they have the First Continental Congress, which you should have already looked up as well, to meet to discuss what are we going to do about the Intolerable Acts and the rest of the stuff. And we're going to meet a year later if nothing works. No one's talking about independence. Everybody but Georgia sent somebody. So there are three things you need to know: the Suffolk Resolves, Declaration of Rights and Grievances, you can read through all that, and the Association, which was a boycott. That brings us to what happened at Lexington and Concord. This is the immediate cause of the war. King George says Massachusetts is in a state of rebellion. Troops were sent in. When you watch The Story of Us, it will show you a good representation of what happened here. The famous one if by land, two if by sea signal. If they come by land, the British should put lanterns in their windows, one. If they come by sea or by water, we'll put 2 lanterns. Paul Revere and others. You'll see this on some of the information as well. Bet you didn't know things in the U.S. history videos you're going to see. Paul Revere did not run through the streets screaming the British are coming. Everybody in America was British, so it didn't really mean anything. He would have said the redcoats or something like that, the lobster backs, and it was actually done in secret. He was going house to house spreading the word, along with William Dawes, Prescott, and about 20 other people. Revere actually got captured and was released and kept going. So this attack at Lexington and attacks at Concord, and then the British get back to Boston. I think I'm going to have a video on the Dropbox for that too. If not, it is in the Story of Us episode. Paul Revere wasn't really famous for anything except that probably that drawing of the Boston Massacre. Until the Civil War, Longfellow wrote a poem about him to inspire patriotism in the Civil War, and that's where this whole idea of Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride came about. Okay, it's a video for, I think, Schoolhouse Rock, No More Kings. Black Americans fought for both sides. You can read this slide. What advantages and disadvantages did the British have in the Americans? Look through that slide. Too Late to Apologize video, really good. Show that on the Dropbox. And then you have 2 links here. This is a Schoolhouse Rock, and then this one is from the play Hamilton, talking about how King George is going to respond to the revolution. Both these links should work for you. Okay, and that's the end of that one.